Now, in 2022, Germany also expressed interest in our LNG, but at that time, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wasn't sold on the long-term business case. And there are other questions about achieving a net zero emission future while also exporting LNG. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's bring back the front bench. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Dan, let's start with you here. Difficult dance for the Liberal government trying to get through all of this one. On one hand, you have a few allies who want our LNG, but on the other side, they're trying to look at the larger environmental impact of all of it.
Well, certainly I think it's going to be really important for the Liberals as they navigate the lead up to the next election, the politics of this moment, and increasing pressure to see Canada export more of our natural resources, that they ensure their posture is very much like what we heard from Francesco Sobera, a Liberal MP who was on your program earlier, which is bring forward the proposals and we'll look at them on their merits. This is a market decision. And if we see ideas that come forward to say we'll build LNG on the East Coast or the West Coast that are economic and have a strong business case behind them, that they'll look at them. And I think that openness is going to be really important as they navigate this moment. The Prime Minister in the past, I think, has been more skeptical of proposals. You mentioned that at the outset there. And I think that's something they should probably try and navigate away. And I think they can sort of do a delicate dance on this issue, if I'll borrow your terminology there, by saying, bring that proposal forward and we'll assess it on its merits. What the Conservatives aren't doing, and I noticed earlier on your program, Andrew Scheer refused to answer the question, is how do you work with certain provinces like Quebec to get infrastructure built? Pierre Poilievre's out on rally saying he's going to do this, but federal governments by decree cannot just get projects like this completed. They can't get pipelines built. They need to work with provinces, they need to work with First Nations and Indigenous communities. And frankly, we just don't see any level of detail in a plan beyond the leader of the opposition announcing they'll get LNG exported. I mean, that's not good enough. We need to see a little bit more detail about how it will be done. The Harper government spent 10 years and no pipelines were built. So it's kind of hard to take them at their word on this one.
Yeah, Shakir, is that the biggest difficulty, that it sounds good at a rally, but really when you have to get down and do the work, that trying to deal with Quebec and make sure that a pipeline gets built east, that might be more difficult?
Yeah, I think, of course, it's an obvious challenge. But I remember when the federal government first implemented its carbon tax, and they told Albertans that, you need to get this social license, embrace carbon pricing, and, that you can kind of move forward with your oil and gas, LNG projects and whatnot. And Alberta accepted the carbon pricing, and they got no pipelines built. They didn't have any social license to move forward on this. So I kind of feel like, you're kind of talking out of both ends of your mouth here. You want to kind of reduce emissions. You want to kind of have people embrace your environmental policies. But there are other groups and stakeholders who want to see things done as well. And like I said, building pipelines, exporting our LNG. And so how do we get to that point? I don't know what that looks like in terms of negotiations with Quebec, but if you're operating in Alberta in the oil and gas sector, you have to have intense frustration. The only thing I would add to this as well, I mean, the federal government often says to provinces that, you need to have an emissions reduction plan because emissions don't stop at your borders. Well, obviously, emissions don't stop at our country's borders as well. And if we have a product that we can get to global markets to help reduce emissions, I think we should find any way possible to get that product to market, right? Ultimately, it's something that's going to help. It's going to displace dirtier forms of energy. So how do we get there? Emissions are not just a Canadian problem, it's a global problem. So we need to find a way to ensure that the planet gets to net zero by 2050. It's not just a Canadian kind of objective.
Yeah, and Kathleen, that is one of those things that they can think about here, because if they're exporting more of it to China, get to China off of coal, and so really that sort of helps us get all emissions down, but it still isn't the cleanest form of energy.
No, but I think it is a reality that, countries will continue to rely on oil resources for some time, for decades to come. And Canada's businesses and our exporters of energy can do well, though, if they embrace a low carbon economic future. And that's the key. It has to be that. Pierre Poilievre is, walking around the country basically with a very consistent message, but it's simplistic and it doesn't mean much because you can't just wave a magic wand and suddenly we're going to get an East Coast LNG plant created, right? There needs to be the business case. There needs to be the environmental case made. And he hasn't made that. He hasn't articulated that. They can continue to dodge the questions, but we've seen recently just 2 LNG projects on the East Coast being nixed because there wasn't the business case made there. There wasn't the environmental case made there. So that has to come first. And the Conservatives need to kind of get their ducks lined up by saying this is going to just happen.
Yeah, Laura, it feels like this comes back to the Liberals trying to be responsible on the environment, but at the same time, Canada is a country which is rich in natural resources, and it would help them if they sold some of them.
Yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of being the opposition leader, right? You can kind of propose, as Kathleen said, these simplistic solutions, and you're not held to the same standard as the government, or the world is more complicated. I find it interesting. I find the Liberal lines of communication on this a bit muddied. I found MP Sauvé on your show, Mike, seemed much more open to the idea than the energy minister's spokesperson, who was quoted in our newspaper based on Bashi's interview, essentially saying, well, this has to match with our climate goals, and we're not rushing into anything that doesn't meet our standards. To me, that seemed much more hesitant than the Liberals are proposing today on your program. So I think there is a bit of a muddied communication as to whether the Liberals support this or not. And, Pierre Poilievre's message, whether it's dealing with the municipalities on housing and whether it's dealing with provinces on projects like this, is essentially to, bulldoze through and get it done no matter what. So that's clearly a message that's resonating. It will be up to the other parties to kind of hold him to account on that, to see, how he'll go about doing that. But in a way, it's a bit of a gift to the politicians who are not in charge of these complex matters, because they can say a lot of things, and these projects take so many months and years to even get underway that it's hard to hold them to account in the same way as the government.